to talk about decreasing behavior. So what does this mean? Everybody's usually pretty motivated to talk about decreasing behavior because everybody's like, we don't want to be hit anymore. We don't want to have tantrums anymore. We don't want any of that. But we're going to talk a lot more about reinforcement actually, because we're going to discuss how we're going to use reinforcement to decrease problem behavior, because that's the main thing that you have to do in order to decrease problem behavior. We're also going to talk about some tactics for teaching compliance, because that's one of the main reasons why people engage in problem behavior is to avoid tasks. We're going to talk a little bit about extinction and how it's related to timeout. Most people are pretty familiar with timeout, but most people don't do it as well as they could or as effective as they could. So we're going to talk about some of the do's and don'ts to this procedure, since it's such a popular procedure. And then we're going to talk about some of the ethical considerations that you need to make when using strategies to reduce problem behaviors, because this is actually a really touchy area. So we want to make sure that we're not causing harm, any more harm than we already have. We're always wanting to cause good. So we're going to talk about making sure that we do it right. So one of the first things that we need to really talk about is, before we can really target a problem behavior, we really have to know why the behavior is occurring. We also have to know when the behavior is occurring, and we want to know what we want the child to be doing instead. Where do we get that information from? How do we answer those questions? The ABC data gives us a lot of information about that. Some other techniques that behavioral consultants or BCBAs can do, like functional analysis. Sometimes we gather some of this information from interview, but the most readily available, easiest information for you guys to collect is the ABC data, because we need to first know why the behavior is occurring. We can't pick a treatment strategy. Remember I said we can't pick a treatment strategy based on what the behavior looks like. We have to know why it's occurring. So let me give you a little quick example of why we might not want to do that. Let's say we have a child who's engaging in problem behavior. They're like tantruming. And let's just take an example of you ask Susie to, I always use Susie, but you ask Susie to do something. You ask Susie to do a math assignment, and you put the math assignment in front of her, and you say, Susie, I want you to do problems 5 and 6, and then Susie starts to cry, she has a tantrum, and then you take her to timeout. So what is going on with that situation? Would that be a good thing to do?
Well, she's essentially escaping doing the problems by going to timeout. So, like you said earlier, if it happened in the past, she cried, went to timeout, and she would know that she could escape the task by going to timeout.
Right. So in that situation, what are you likely to be doing to the behavior? Increasing it or decreasing it? The problem behavior of tantruming.
Oh, you're increasing it.
You're increasing it. So that, what do you guys remember what the definition of a reinforcer is? Not something that you like, not something that you want. It's something that increases the future frequency of behavior. So do we like a timeout?
Not in that scenario.
No. Do we want a timeout? We want a timeout, actually, don't we? We want a timeout. So a timeout in this situation, because it increases the future frequency of the behavior, a timeout is a reinforcer. Do we want the timeout to be a reinforcer? No, but we haven't read the behavior. So in that kind of a situation, the timeout is a reinforcer. Now let's take the same behavior, tantruming. Okay, so Susie is tantruming, but this time she's tantruming because she wants access to a toy. And she's crying and she's like, whatever. And then you take her over and you give her a timeout. So in that situation, is it a reinforcer? No. So that might be a situation where she wants access to the toy. She doesn't get access to the toy. So maybe in the future, she's not going to use that behavior again. So that could decrease the future frequency of that behavior. And in that case, that would be more of a punisher. But we wouldn't know whether or not we should use timeout unless we completed the first step, which is first identifying the function of the behavior. If we just talk about tantruming and we say every time the child tantrums, we're going to use a timeout procedure, we might not be doing it for the right reason. We might actually make the behavior worse rather than making the behavior better based on our procedure. So we really have to consider, why does the behavior occur? Now, what about the when the behavior occurs? Why do we need to know when the behavior occurs?
That can tell us part of the antecedent, what prompts it to happen.
Yeah, like one of the things, remember when we were talking about the little girl who was pacing back and forth in the kitchen? Now, we were concerned about that part of it because that tells us when we can intervene, right? So the same kind of things, there might be times where we might want to do a timeout, and then there might be times when we might not want to do a timeout, or we might want to do some other procedure. But our data can help lead us to when we should use a certain procedure as well, and when to be ready to do a procedure, particularly if we're going to do a teaching procedure. If we're prepared for that, or if we have a plan for that, then we're more likely to do it correctly and do it well. So if we know when we're going to use a procedure, that's helpful as well. What we want the child to do instead. Why do we want to know what we want the child to do instead?
So that we know what we can reinforce.
Yeah.
So they'll continue to do that instead of the other thing.
Yeah, because we have this problem behavior, but it's meeting their needs. If we get them to stop doing that problem behavior and we don't give them another behavior to do instead, what are they likely to do?
Just rely on the same ones.
They're probably still going to go back to that behavior, or they might pick a new behavior themselves. And if they pick a new behavior themselves, they probably aren't going to pick one that's any better than the other behavior that they picked. So if we can identify a replacement behavior for them that we start to reinforce, then this whole process happens a lot faster. And remember, all of that stuff comes from your ABC data, most of it. Some of it's going to come from other kinds of testing on skill development and things like that, but we really want to evaluate that data to determine where we're going. So let's do a couple of examples. Susie's asked to read a book with her mom. She doesn't want to read the book, so she grabs the book and throws it. Susie is given a timeout. So super simple, right? What does Susie want? A timeout. What does Susie get? A timeout. She wants to get out of reading the book, and then she does get out of reading the book. So what will Susie do again next time that she wants to get out of a task? She's going to throw the book. Good. Super simple, right? Let's look at this one. Susie sees her brother with her favorite toy. She asks her brother for the toy. He says no. She then hits her brother and takes the toy. Susie's given a timeout, and her brother is given the toy back. What does Susie want? The toy. What does Susie get? A timeout. Will Susie be as likely to hit her brother the next time she wants his toy? Not necessarily. I mean, she might, because what happened first? She did get the toy, didn't she? She got it for a second, so it depends on how valuable the toy is, and it depends on how much she doesn't like the timeout. But those are some of the variables that you can manipulate. But in general, she didn't get what she wanted. So she's not as likely to do that again in the future. All right, so when we're reducing problem behavior, one of the most important things that we need to think about is the increasing of the positive behavior first. Remember, I talked about pairing yourself with reinforcement. If we don't do the positive behavior and offer lots and lots of reinforcement, then you're going to be paired with punishment. And when you're paired with punishment, then you are pretty aversive. And when you're implementing aversive procedures, excuse me, one of the things that's likely to happen is you're going to get more problem behavior. And when you implement punishment procedures, or if you take away reinforcers, people tend to try harder. The behavior tends to get worse. You tend to have more problems up front before the behavior goes away. If you implement all the positive stuff before you do that, you don't get as big of a problem because they then know what to do instead. You're not just taking away reinforcers, you're giving an alternative to them. You're saying, okay, I don't want you to do this anymore, but this is what you should do instead. And now you're really good at it, and it's not hard to do because we've already taught you how to do it. So it becomes a really easy transition. So the things that we're going to talk about are teaching compliance. We're going to talk about some of the do's and don'ts of timeout and how that's related to extinction. And I want you to really think about these things because I don't want you to just take them back and just implement them. I want you to think about why you would implement them and under which conditions you would implement them so that you're prepared for some of the problems that you may come in contact with when you do. So when you're dealing with escape as a function, so we've taken our ABC data, we've determined that the child is doing something to get out of something. What is the best way to change a behavior when you're dealing with escape? What's the problem with the situation?
Change what you want them to do.
Okay, so let's say they have to learn how to do the task. They have to learn how to talk, okay? You can't not teach them how to talk or communicate or something like that, but why would you change what you want them to do? What's the idea behind that?
To bring them back into wanting to do something with you, make it more pleasurable for them.
Okay, so we've got a task that's too hard because we don't want to escape things that we like, right? We want to escape things that are aversive. We want to escape things that are too hard. We want to escape things that we don't want to do. So in order to try to counter escape behavior, the thing that we have to do is change the kind of task that we're asking them to do. So some of the things that you have to ask yourself is, am I asking them to do a task that's reasonable for them to do? Look at the whole child, look at their skill deficits, look at the kinds of things that you're asking them, and does it line up with where they're at within their development? Are they making a ton of errors before they get a correct response? Are they accessing the reinforcement pieces enough in order to actually have a positive experience, or is it someone just correcting them over and over and over again? So it doesn't necessarily mean that when you're engaging in escape behavior, you discontinue that task and go to something positive. But what would you do? Actually, let's think about that for a minute. Let's say I'm engaging in a problem behavior for escape, and then I discontinue that task and I go to something easier. What happens as part of the consequence?
You still allow the escape to occur.
You allowed the escape to occur because you took away what? The initial task that was too hard, and you still give a task, but an easier task is more reinforcing than a hard task, right? So when do you change the task difficulty? Kind of. You want to plan for the next event. The next time that you sit that child down, you're like, okay, I made a mistake. I presented a task that was too difficult. So I'm going to start with an easier task. I'm not going to wait until they have problem behavior and then reduce the task difficulty. I'm going to start with an easier task. So let's just take a super simple example. I want the child to ask for something, and I want them to say, I want cookie, please, Mom. Okay? That's a long phrase. A lot of people want the kid to do that. Well, let's say I say, Johnny, say, I want cookie, please, Mom. And he goes, I want, and then stops. And I'm like, no, say, I want cookie, please, Mom. And then he says, I want cookie, Mom. And then, we go back and forth, and then finally he gets frustrated and he starts to cry. And then I go, okay, well, let's just, say cookie. So then he says cookie and I give him that. Okay, so that obviously reinforces the behavior. Next time, I need to start with that easier response. Say cookie. And then he says cookie. Say cookie again, and then he says cookie. So he gets it very frequently. It becomes very easy to get the cookie, and then he doesn't want to engage in the escape behavior because the task is actually easier than the tantrum. And then when you get that kind of fluency going in there, and you get that exchange, I ask you to do something, you get something. I ask you to do something, you get something. Then you can add on another word, cookie please, or I want cookie, or something like that, and you make the task difficulty increase over time based on success, not decrease task difficulty based on failure. Does that make sense to everybody? And then you're going to get long-term behavior change rather than increasing negative behavior over the short term. Okay, did I cover everything with this? So thinking about the effort and also thinking about what do they get for actually completing the task. Sometimes, has anybody ever run a plan where you have to administer intermittent reinforcement? Okay. Can somebody describe to me what that means? Does anybody know? What's the difference between intermittent reinforcement and continuous reinforcement?